On this episode of Travel Tomorrow, we're talking about the rise of the influencer, the smoke and mirrors behind some of those gorgeous social media photos, and how to sort through our own biases and the biases of others so we can see the world a little more clearly and be a better traveler. Hi, everybody. I'm Alicia Underly Nelson. This is the second episode of Travel Tomorrow, the podcast where we talk about what's new and what's next in travel. I am here in West Fargo, North Dakota, where the weather is seasonably fall-like, and I'm joined by my co-host, Joe Bauer, in Dusseldorf. How are you?
Oh, I'm swell. Excited to be talking about influencers and all the pretty pictures they share.
Marvelous.
Does that sound genuine?
No, it does not. It sounds deeply sarcastic.
I guess seventh grade theater has not stuck with me very well.
No, I would say your intention is coming through loud and clear, so seventh grade theater was probably quite effective.
It's not that I'm not excited to talk about influencers, but I don't like how they make other people feel. I'll put it that way.
But they do inspire people to travel, which is not a bad thing.
No, that is not a bad thing. But if it gets to the point where you're only traveling for the photo, to do the same photo a million other people before you have done, then I think that can be problematic, especially if it's straining local resources in a place where they're not prepared for such an influx.
Well, speaking of an influx of travelers taking the same photo as all the other travelers before them, Joe has our first stop.
Now boarding.
Well, yes, I do have today's first stop. Fortune magazine editor Polina Marinova, hope I'm saying that right, discovered that the Gates of Heaven temple in Bali, Indonesia, isn't exactly what it seems. You may have seen this photo under the hashtag Gate of Heaven. It looks like this reflecting pool, but it's actually a mirror held under an iPhone, and apparently the whole operation was made up by enterprising locals who found a way to make a little money by giving tourists exactly the Instagram type of image they wanted. So what do you think? Do you think this is an unethical thing to do to kind of trick people from flying all across the world for this image that isn't really there? Or is it kind of, especially a place like Bali that's as far as I can tell, is getting overrun by tourism, is a kind of schadenfreude, so to speak?
Well, my first instinct actually was to think it was funny and really clever for the people that set it up. I mean, I don't know who started this, if it organically came from locals living around the site and they found a way to make money on it, or if they saw someone doing it and decided to start their own little side business. But there are huge lines to do this. So, I mean, I guess in a way, that's a way for the local people to turn maybe a negative, having lots of people coming to a site and not really benefiting from it, into a huge positive. So, like, the entrepreneur in me thinks that's great. But the journalist in me cannot figure out why there are, like, thousands of posts under this hashtag, and people are talking about, like, the beauty of this site and the wait that they had and how it was totally worth it. And nobody thought to mention that this wasn't actually real and there was no water there. Like, that is a little bit
That's kind of what blows my mind. And we can share the article we got this from, Indy100.com. What kind of blows my mind is that people, obviously they find out that they go there and do it, and the captions are not even saying anything about it being, I don't know if hoax is the right word, but a bit of a scheme. And I want to read one of the captions on one of these images. It's just, I think it distills, it's pure Instagram. Like, you could copy and paste most of this for almost any type of Instagram inspirational photo. It says, first it says, opportunity knocks on the door, me. Create the life you wish to live. There is no one else who can make it happen but you. I'm just here to hold a door open along the way. And I think that's referring to the Gate of Heaven. So excited to be sharing my Bali journey with each and every one of you. So many amazing experiences. Reach out to me for more. And it's like so many of these other images, it's the reflected pool effect, and no mention of this not being what it is.
I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and I think it depends on the intention that that's used for, because I have friends that are wedding photographers and they will post these photos of the bride and groom by this pond, but really it's a reflection of them off of a small puddle after the rain. Well, if it's a really pretty photo that you're going to put in your house and your grandkids are going to look at, nobody really cares that the lake by the chapel where you got married doesn't actually exist. It doesn't matter. It's an artistic effect. But the issue here is that I assume this is a woman. I don't know why. The tone makes me think that. But this Instagrammer then is saying, reach out to me for information about Bali. Well, if this person's not sharing that this image isn't real and that this temple is not how people perceive it to be, then can we really trust the other things that she's telling us about Bali? How do we know that they're not illusions too? And that really gets down to the core of what we're talking about in this episode. The fact that there are thousands of people who took photos here at this spot in Bali, and nobody thought to mention that the photo was staged, shows you how really tricky it can be to sort through all these different travel narratives and really find information that you can trust and that's accurate. It used to be easier. Traditional travel outlets like magazines and newspapers had strict fact-checking. You could trust that what those stories printed was more or less true. But now those are competing with a huge range of personal narratives, which are great and give us more depth and more dimension. But they're also shared on a variety of platforms: social media, travel blogs, Instagram influencers, YouTube, and new platforms that literally pop up every week. And everybody has information, everybody has an opinion and a story, but the rules and the ethics that govern each outlet are very different, and we're still really sorting through that, even those of us that are in the travel industry like Joe and myself. So to help us sort through it all, I interviewed Rebecca Holland, editor of Curiosity magazine, about how the travel industry is changing, how to refine our own critical reading and critical thinking skills, and how to be a better traveler. I started my interview with Rebecca by asking her to define the difference between a travel writer and an influencer, and to dig a little deeper into some of the terms for insiders in the travel industry.
So travel writers are, I think one of the most important differences is that they're paid by publications and they don't work for themselves. Even if they're freelancing, they have contracts with different publications. And so they are kind of beholden to editors and publication standards, and they are never paid by brands. Whereas travel bloggers, they run their own sites, and sometimes they make money from advertisements and things, but sometimes they are paid by brands or destinations. And they, a lot of them do have really strict standards for themselves, but they're not beholden to the same sort of editorial standards of like the New York Times or something like that. Photographers are different, but becoming more blended. I mean, traditionally they only did photos. Now a lot of freelance travel writers also take their own photos. Bloggers kind of do everything. They do the photography, the social media, the writing, everything. And then influencers, a lot of times it's just social media. So, and I think especially Instagram. So they are only photo-based and caption-based and posting on social media all the time, whereas travel writers sometimes don't have to worry about social media at all if the publication does that part of it, or they do their own personal social media, but it's not as much a part of their job as the actual writing.
Excellent. So how can the average travel news consumer, or somebody that's scrolling through Instagram or Facebook, tell the difference between these professions?
It's pretty hard, and I think it's becoming harder and harder because the travel writing industry, like for magazines, is not going very well, to be honest. Like a lot of magazines are closing or rely more on their freelancers to do their own promotion and stuff. So if you're just scrolling through Instagram, a lot of freelance travel writers do like some influencer things for brands that don't overlap with travel writing, but then they do travel writing for publications, and then sometimes they also have their own blog. So it can be really confusing. I guess the main thing would be to look on their bio, and it would usually say, or if you see a publication, like if you see an article in a magazine, then you know it's a travel writer. If you see a blog, it's obviously a blog. But it is really difficult to tell. And one of the things that I think a lot of travel writers get offended by is when people say, oh, you're a travel writer, like, so do you have a blog? And I was like, no, I write for Condé Nast Traveler or Afar magazine or something. And I think for the average person, they don't really get it. And it's insulting for the travel writer, but also I understand why they don't get it because it's really confusing.
You touched a little bit on editorial standards in more traditional journalism and photography. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons that people that consider themselves primarily travel writers or travel photographers do get offended, because they do hold themselves to different editorial standards. Can you talk a little bit about what those standards are in the industry and how they might be changing with the rise of influencers?
Sure. So there are some basic things when it just comes to writing and grammar and following like a style book, like AP style or something like that. Then there are the more complex things like not being influenced by a brand or something. So traditionally, most travel writers could not accept free gifts or trips or things like that. And if you do, I know that some publications still have this in place, like the New York Times and the Washington Post and places that are also news organizations. If you take a free trip from somewhere or accept a gift from somewhere, then you can never write about that place or that thing. And so that's different from bloggers and influencers. And I think that travel writers think, okay, we are more unbiased because we do not accept these free things, and so we can't be influenced by a brand or something. That is changing a little bit. A lot of places have become more relaxed on their standards because it is just a way to supplement travel and supplement paying your freelancers as much, or paying for their travel. So they do accept more free trips and things. And so the line is becoming more blurred, or because some freelance writers work as influencers for, say they partner with an airline, but then they write about a different destination and it's not necessarily the same thing, but maybe you could be influenced by that in some way. So it's definitely becoming a more blurred line. But also when travel writers, I think that they have higher editorial standards, it's because a lot of them, it was a writing job first and they went to journalism school or something, which is, it's like 4 years of education focused on one specific thing. And I think like anyone can start a blog and not anyone's blog will be successful, and blogging is definitely very hard to do well. But I think a lot of travel writers think, okay, I went to school for this, I'm a journalist, it's different. And there are standards and you are not as biased.
And how has the travel industry changed since you started? I know you have a journalism background, so have you seen the emphasis shift since you started, and how have you adjusted to those changes in your site?
Yeah, it's changed a lot. I've been freelancing for almost 6 years, mostly about travel and food. And I think there's much more of an emphasis on lists now, and which I understand because those are what people are searching for, and every publication needs to survive. And so if you have, good SEO, people will click on your links. So like top 10 places to visit in X city, or like 5 foods to try in Italy, or things like that. Those do so much better than the traditional long form travel narrative type stories. Even big places like Condé Nast or Travel and Leisure, the New York Times, like they've shifted even more towards those things where they traditionally did the longer stories. So at Curiosity Magazine, we are kind of resisting that and not publishing any lists. So we have a policy actually that we don't publish lists. So I'm just kind of hoping that there is still an appetite for that and people find it refreshing. But I'm not sure if it's going to work, but that's what we are hoping for, is to stay with the old school, like longer form articles that teach people something about a place and not go the list route.
Excellent. That's definitely countercultural in a time when people are writing for SEO or search engine optimization. So what are the benefits and drawbacks of focusing on that more old school, long form focus on travel writing?
I think the benefits are that once you find people who like it, it's people who definitely like that type of writing and they'll keep coming back. It's not like they found the site because they were searching for something to do on a trip, which is how a lot of people find list type articles. They're going to Italy, say, and so they're researching and they come across an article and they read it to plan for that trip and then don't go back to the site. I think if someone comes to our site, it's because of a different reason, and so then they're more likely to come back to it because they like those types of stories and continue reading it. The benefits are also people stay on the site for longer because the stories are longer. And I hope they learn something. And then the drawbacks are that it's harder for them to find the site in the first place. So we rely a lot more on our writers sharing the stories and doing our own social media. And so that is definitely a drawback, because social media is difficult and time consuming and can be really expensive if you're trying to pay for Facebook ads or things like that to get your site seen. So we've been around for a little over a year now. And over the first year, that was probably our biggest takeaway and struggle, is that once people find the site, they seem to come back a lot and really like it, but getting them to see it without those SEO type articles is difficult. So we'll be thinking how to change that in year 2.
And you brought up the expense of travel writing as a profession. That's one of, I think, the most common misconceptions that I hear from people outside the industry, is this idea that it looks very glamorous, or that writers and photographers are on vacation all the time and having a lot of fun. But I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about the compensation that writers can expect for the amount of time that they put into the average story.
Yeah, it is very sad and much lower than anyone thinks. Even my close friends and family, they ask me all the time, or say all the time, wow, it's so great. You get to travel all the time and get paid for it. What a great job. And obviously I think it's a great job. I wouldn't keep doing it, but it is not a great job because of the compensation. Most places pay around $150 to $300 per story for around 500 to 800 words. Some places pay much lower. Some places pay, like places that have set rates for their other news type stories, like the New York Times, for example, pays $1 per word. I think for Travel and Leisure and Condé Nast Traveler, if you're writing for their print section, it's closer to $1 per word. Same with Afar. But if you're writing for their websites, which is what it's really hard to get articles placed in the print publications. And if you're writing for websites for different travel magazines, it falls way down to around $150 to $300 per story. So then you have to think of that story, and first you had to travel to the place, research it. If you're writing for magazines, you'll need to interview. That's another thing that's different from blogging. You'll have to get interviews and quotes from people that are not yourself, and a lot of times take the photos and then come back and actually write it, and then go through 1 or 2 rounds of edits with the editor, and then finally it's published, and then 30 to 90 days later you get paid $150. So it's a lot of work for a pretty low amount. Most travel writers I know try to write 3 or 4 different stories for every trip they take, so it covers it a little bit. And then there are press trips, which is what I was talking about before, when destinations bring writers to a place for free to show them the destination. They're usually put on by the tourism board of that destination, or sometimes by hotels. But then it becomes harder if you go on those trips, which a lot of travel writers do, because otherwise they would never be able to afford to travel. But if you go on those trips, then you have to think about the places that will accept those stories that are from destinations where things were paid for, or if you can write about an aspect of the destination that wasn't covered on the trip. So it becomes kind of complicated.
It's definitely a balancing act. And then, of course, as you know, then you're on a press trip and you're doing very long days, and you're balancing the rest of your work as well, emails and other interviews for other stories and more pitches. So it does get to be a lot of time that I don't think the average person realizes.
Right, especially because you usually stay, if you do go on these press trips, at really beautiful hotels, and depends where you are, but say there's like a pool or something, or beaches. And most writers I know never actually experience all the best parts of the hotels, because they're like, oh, I can't just go to the pool. And you're like waking up early to frantically finish your other articles. And then, when you have downtime, you're working. So it's not the same as just going there on vacation.
No, it's definitely not a vacation if you're maximizing every 15-minute break in your schedule to work.
Right. Also, because I'm not sure about everyone, but the vast majority of travel writers I know, because it's so low paid, they also do some other sort of job, whether it's like an administrative job or like an online, like something like that, or translating, or a lot of people do copywriting. I write for a few different legal blogs in Chicago. And so people do a lot of other side projects that are not necessarily travel related to supplement the travel. And so, you're kind of always working on those things in the background.
Exactly. And that brings me to something that you touched on earlier. The New York Times and other outlets have a similar policy, but the New York Times ignited a really fierce debate in the industry because it said that it won't accept pitches from writers who have not only gone on press trips for the article that they're writing about, but people that have accepted any complimentary products for 3 years before writing for the publication. And that obviously excludes a number of people, myself included. So what are the consequences, both intended and unintended, when publications take a stance like this?
Well, yeah, first of all, I think this is a ridiculous policy, and probably I've written about how I think it's ridiculous, and probably because of that, we'll never be able to write for the New York Times again. But I think that their intention is that you become extremely unbiased and that there's no way anything can be a conflict of interest. And I get why they have that policy to a point, because they're not a travel publication, like they're a news organization, and I get why they have to have that. But 3 years is just so long, and I think one of the worst consequences of it is that you only get a certain type of writer then. Like, for the people who can actually pay for these types of trips or subsist on writing only for the New York Times and one or two other places that have these policies, like, even though they are some of the best paying publications, you would still have to write so many stories a year. Say they pay $1 per word and you write a 700 word story or something, or even 1,000 word story, it's $1,000, but you're not going to be doing that a couple times a month. And so you would have to just do so many stories. It's basically not possible to live off of that. And so you're only getting people who have another source of income, or like a spouse who has a better job or something, or inheritance, or these other, you're not getting a lot of people who are just getting into the industry or are from different backgrounds. And I think that is really problematic. And you can see in some of these places, when you look at their list of authors, they don't have a very diverse group of writers. And I think that is a problem, especially when you're talking about travel writing, which is about the whole world. And you should have people from all over the world, from all different backgrounds, talking about their travel experiences or giving insight into places. And a lot of places, it's not possible if you aren't allowed to accept anything free, especially because you could be writing about, say you go on a press trip to Montana and then you're writing about Mexico. Those are totally different destinations. And so to say that you can't write about Mexico because you once accepted a free trip to Montana 2 years ago, I mean, it seems insane to me. It just doesn't seem logical. I can understand why they wouldn't want you to go on a free trip to Mexico and write about Mexico. I'm completely fine with them having that policy, but 3 years for any destination anywhere in the world just seems crazy, especially because I don't think it's always enforced for certain writers that they've had for a long time, and it's also just really unfair.
So how does your website attempt to get around that and to encourage diversity and to encourage people that are at all different stages in their career and from all different backgrounds to contribute?
Sure. So we pay all of our writers, we pay between $150 and $300 per story. For our first few months, we only paid $150 to be fully transparent, because the magazine originally was funded by a Kickstarter and then was funded out of my own freelancing salary. So we just couldn't pay anymore. In year 2, we're hoping to go more towards the $300 rate. All of our stories, we do both reported and personal essays, and they're mostly from local writers. So I think because our stories are not as much like travel narratives, they're more like learning about a place, I think it's better to have a local perspective. That's not always true. I think for some travel writing, like obviously it's travel writing, so there is something to be said for someone going and exploring and like discovering something on their own. But for our stories, since they usually have a social or political element or are teaching something about like the history or something like that, we like to have local context. And so we have local writers, so there's not a lot of actual travel cost involved. Like, you can write about your own city, and we pay, and we try to pay pretty immediately. And yeah, I think the main thing is that they're usually local writers. And so we have people from all over, even people who don't really have any writing experience. We work with them a lot on the editing process and stuff, or people who English is not their first language maybe, so the writing doesn't come across as polished as it would in other magazines. We work with them on that. And we try to pay quickly and not have a lot of travel fees involved.
One thing that I did like about your site is I can see that emphasis on context and local connections, not just on the page where you ask for submissions, but also running throughout the content on the site. And there is an emphasis on being a better traveler in general. So how can we all learn to be better travelers, whether we're in the travel industry or not?
Yeah, so be a better traveler is kind of our tagline and our hashtag on social media and everything. And it's basically just being curious. I mean, the magazine is Curiosity Magazine, but just kind of asking more questions, just thinking like, why do people do this? Or like, what am I eating? Instead of just being like, these are the top 5 foods I should try, and I'll make sure I try them and check them off, and maybe they're delicious, asking a little bit more about like, why was this dish created here? Like, what goes into it? Like, how was it made? What is the history of it? I mean, food history is so interesting. And I think if you ask those questions and talk to people, there are always so many cool stories, and people are happy to talk about stuff like that. And you'll come back with just like a way richer experience and so much more knowledge. And it'll be next time you see that food somewhere in the US, or you serve it to your friends or something, you'll just have a way cooler story to go with it than just like, oh, this is a food I ate here and I know nothing about it other than this is what's in it. And same with political things or social things. I think before you go somewhere, like you could go to anywhere, like I'll use Italy again as an example, and have a great trip and research everything you're supposed to do and not really learn anything about the current political context there or economy or anything like that. And obviously that's a lot to expect from people who are going on a vacation. But if you even just do a little bit of background research, what if someone came to the US and didn't know who our president was? That would be crazy. So I think other places the same service to just learn a little bit about like, okay, what type of government do you have? Who is in charge? What are some major issues in your country? And just have a little bit of background of that before going somewhere.
So as we close, what are a few takeaway tips that you could offer the average vacationer to help them travel more with a more curious spirit and to learn more about the place that they're visiting in depth? What are a few things that they can learn or take with them as they go?
Yeah. Well, depending on where you're going, we have a guide selection that goes through all these things. They're pretty short, but there's a politics section, history, culture, like cultural do's and don'ts for each place, which I think is important. Things about tipping and other things, just like this is rude to say or this is good to do or whatever. So we have them only for about 10 places right now, but take a look and see if where you're going is one of them. Otherwise, it's pretty easy to do your own research. Honestly, like Wikipedia is pretty good for stuff like this. But just look up basic like government in each place issues, and then kind of like, what are some cultural things I shouldn't do? And there's always blogs about these things. And then keeping sustainability in mind, that's another huge way you can be a better traveler, is that travel itself is not very sustainable. I mean, flights are really bad for the environment. Almost any mode of transportation is not great. And so if you can mitigate that by, bringing your own water bottle, or like not washing your sheets all the time, like think all the little things that you can do. I know they're all really small and sometimes seem kind of pointless, but hopefully they add up because travel is not good for the earth, but it is good for people, I think. So trying to make it as sustainable as possible is important.
So once again, that was Rebecca Holland, editor of Curiosity Magazine, which brings me to the question that I have been dying to discuss since Rebecca first opened her mouth. Is objectivity even possible, or is it a myth? What do you think?
It like anything else, it depends how you want to define it. If you want to be really splitting hairs, and of course, objectivity is a myth. We all have our own biases based on where we're born, how we were raised, just so many things. And so to say that there's some being who's able to rise above it all and discard that when covering something, I think is a bit silly.
I think, though... Wait, I have to stop and think about this. Sorry.
There's no time for thinking in podcasting.
I know, there's no time.
And I'm editing this, so it's going to be a thing where I'm going to cut all my edits and pauses really tight, so it seems like I'm rapid fire, but for you, I'm just going to leave those. You're
going to make me sound like
pauses.
A bumbling idiot. Thank you, darling. That's so sweet of you. I appreciate it.
I might even put in some stutters, because usually you take out the stutters, the uhs and ums. I might just go drop some in there.
Hush. All right, I'm going to respond to that, finally. I think it shows that we're evolving in our discussion of biases and objectivity, because we're actually able to say that maybe it is possible that our own experiences influence us. In science, in journalism, in the last several years, I think it's been the gold standard that we say, no, I'm completely objective. I'm separating my personal response from this entirely. But I think we've all had to look really hard at how we do bring our own experiences to the table. And I think now that there's a richer variety of voices reporting on similar stories, we're able to see how 10 or 20 people can go to the same place and come away with a very different interpretation of that. And instead of saying, no, this official newspaper report is correct and the rest are wrong, we're able to say, wait, maybe there's truth in all of these, and find ways to actually ask some more, insightful questions about why they're different. And I think that's huge. I think we all try in this industry to be as objective as possible, but at least now there's a way that we can say and be honest about the ways that we realize we're not. And I think at least now there's a greater sense of accountability that we can actually call each other out when maybe we aren't reporting something as fully as we can.
You touched on something that we haven't really talked about yet, that you did talk about in your interview with Rebecca. If I ever accumulated the kind of wealth where it's just, I don't want to say that it's disgusting wealth. It's just wealth. Like, just, I'm okay. I've always kind of dreamed of being able to use my money to create like travel writing scholarships or something to that effect, to send people who come from underrepresented countries in travel media to go to different destinations and give their perspective. Because as I'm sure you can attest to as well from being on press trips, it's almost always white people. The balance between men or women, I think, depends on the kind of trip it is. But rarely do you get a person of color perspective on a lot of these countries. And it's first of all, you already have the fact that the countries who are putting on these press trips, they're going to be wealthier countries. So a lot of European countries, Canadian provinces, American states, they're going to be hosting the press trips, and they're going to be working more often than not people who come from a place of privilege. So I've always been kind of like, I would love to hear, I don't know, the Salvadoran perspective on traveling to Germany rather than, another European's perspective or yet another America's perspective on going to someplace like that. Would you read something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to see that. And I would love to see one difference that we didn't discuss was class. I would love to see different working class people, blue collar people covering some of these destinations as well. Because when you go on a press trip, you're not just going to typically wealthier countries. You're going to the best restaurants. You're going to interesting neighborhoods, which typically have been recently gentrified. You're not seeing a full picture of what life for all residents of that city is like. And that's not a critique of press trips, nor is it a critique of tourism partners. It just makes sense that people want to show you the most beautiful, the most famous, the most popular, the most up-and-coming areas, and that's often not representative as well.
But how do you get around that? I want to know, because I have my own tricks for getting around that. So you've gone on a press trip, they give you your itinerary, and they say, because I think what people don't realize is how tight these itineraries can be, and it's not always really that fun. Sometimes it is work. It may sound ridiculous and classist to complain about going to a really nice restaurant, but it's all jam-packed into a point where you're not really able to experience it like really anybody truly experiences a destination other than travel writers on a press trip. So do you have any ways that you try to work in, I guess, a bit of reality into your press trips so that you have something different that you can go back home and either just share to your friends and family or actually report on?
Rebecca and I talked about that too, how the press trip itself, and even a research trip, if you're not hosted by a tourism company, if you're researching for a story, that automatically skews because you're going to be traveling in a way that's not necessarily the way that you would normally travel if you didn't have a particular assignment. And you do have those 14 or 16-hour days, and you may only have 15 minutes in between. But for me, I always, whenever possible, I try to schedule as much break time as possible, and that's not always something that people can make happen. But I do ask for time before or after the scheduled time. I do get up early. I do stay out late. If there's free time, I do try to wander as much as possible. And basically, I do not stick to an itinerary. I look at what the recommended neighborhoods are, but I spend a lot of time talking to people. And I'm always interested in what taxi drivers have to think, or what the waitress has to think, or the barista. Like, I'm interested in where they go, not necessarily the top 10 restaurants in their city, because I can get that by Googling it. I can deduce that information by looking at the resources that are available. I'm interested in where they go. And I tend to just follow that. So I'll have the barista tell me, I'll have my morning coffee, have the barista tell me someplace to check out after lunch. And when there's that hour of free time, if I don't have to return emails or do something for an assignment, I will go where she tells me to go, and then ask the person at that particular attraction or site or restaurant where I should go next. And I just follow that around. And I think that's equally valid, because that's how I would be traveling if I weren't on assignment. That's what I'd be doing if I weren't on a press trip. I'd just be asking questions and going from one place to another.
And what you describe, I think, is a perfect retort to a lot of people. I get, the New York Times point of view of saying, if you've what's the rule? You can't go out, you can't write an article for the New York Times if you've been on a press trip. What is it? Within 3 years?
Yes. Yep. 3 years, which eliminates so many people in this industry.
And that's and I know you don't come from wealth. I don't come from wealth. And we're still white people in the United States. So not saying that perspective isn't covered, but you still get, what you said was still a really nice retort to people saying that, this keeps the integrity, because anybody who goes on a press trip, their coverage is going to be skewed towards positivity for the destination. But as you will certainly know, and I know you've got stories, people who are on these press trips treat it differently. There are people who don't talk to locals, who don't really engage at all, and they do treat it just like a free trip that they swindled the destination out of. So I would, because I know you, and I'm sure other people who have followed your work and are your audience, so to speak, they trust your voice, and they could really give two shits that you got a free trip or you got a free dinner or free hotel or whatever. They trust that you treated that like you would if you were paying out of your own pocket. At least that's what I think.
I think so too. And I think as long as you're true to your audience and to your style, it doesn't necessarily matter how you're getting to that destination. We all are doing our best to live the most interesting life that we can, to go as many places. And many of us have to be creative about how we do that. But for me personally, I always try to make sure that I'm covering street food, that I'm covering walkable destinations, that I'm imagining myself in the shoes of the person that's going to read this article. So if this is a person who's 25 years old and is traveling on a budget, I'm going to think, great, here's this great hotel that I'm in. What can I do within walking distance? What can I do that's a cheap Uber ride away? How can I access public transportation in a way that's effective? Am I making sure that I'm covering restaurants in every price point? And I think there are simple ways that all of us can do that, even when we're traveling in our own personal lives. Like, instead of just showing the highlights, instead of just showing photos of us by the Eiffel Tower doing all these great mountaintop bucket list experiences, let's talk about how challenging it was to figure something out. Let's talk about how to actually book that ticket. Like, that information is helpful to people that might be looking to travel as well. So I think anybody can be an influencer in that way, even if you're just posting stories about, your trip to Europe. I have friends that did that, and it was really great because they took their kids. It was their first time abroad, but it wasn't just a collection of highlights that makes everybody think, wow, how impressive. I'm kind of jealous. I'm tuning out. They had real life information. They talked about how their kids who were in high school kind of led them and directed the itinerary. And that was really interesting because it was their experience. They gave me real information. And yeah, it was personal to them. But that gave me so much more than just a collection of photos or just a top 10 or something basic like that. So I think anybody, whether you're a professional or not, has an ability to travel better and more in depth and give other people more information, whether you get paid for it or not.
Power to the traveler. Woo.
Indeed.
Oh, I know we have to get over to language love, but before we do that, I was wondering, and you can say no, if you can very quickly distill in a way that you don't reveal any key characteristics your worst press trip story. And I'm referring to not necessarily worse that it was bad to you, because I'm trying to point you in a certain direction, and I think I know you know where I'm pointing you, but to where there was a certain individual, won't even say the gender, where this person really represented themselves poorly.
Yes, that is the important thing. I have a background in advertising. I have a background in marketing. And so I'm used to working with clients. I'm used to being professional. And I would say 99% of the people that I've come across, whether it's influencers or, professional journalists or photographers, represent themselves the same way. We want to get the best information. We want to see a place. We want to honor the hosts that are helping show us around. And oftentimes we're working with, tour guides that are not employed by this company. We're working with partners and business owners in the country that we're visiting. And it's important to show respect. I think that's just basic goodness and basic diplomacy. And I went on a trip. One of the individuals on the trip definitely did not follow those unspoken rules, and it made it really difficult for all of the other journalists in the group. But it really was an incredible moment where we all banded together and tried to save it. But it all started when we went to a party. And what was really funny is this individual was telling us about a time when they had seen somebody behaving unprofessionally. So we thought, wonderful. Here is a group of people, and we were in this particular country to study the evolving beer scene, which is something that I specialize in. So it's always good when you're covering an intoxicant to know that the people that you're working with know how to handle themselves. So we all had this discussion. We were all on the same page. We went to the very first party, which was great. It was in a warehouse. There was tons of breweries there. We were interviewing wonderful local people. And this individual decided that they were not going to respond to the group text. They were staying here, and got very agitated and unprofessional with the other folks in the group. And we thought, wow, somebody's had too much to drink. Okay, one of our colleagues decided to stay behind, make sure that this individual behaved themselves. And he reported back a few hours later saying that it did not go well. He wished he would have had reinforcements stay with them because the individual in question was badgering our hosts and all the owners of the breweries for drugs, which were not legal in this country.
You're not even talking about drugs that are legal in some countries. Well, I guess, I don't know, maybe Portugal? I don't know. But you're talking about like drugs.
No, I am talking like walking up to people whose job it was to be a bridge to local culture and demanding cocaine. A definite no-no in everyday traveler's life, and it's definitely not cool if you're on a press trip. So we helped our colleague as he was a little bit frantic. We got back the next day and we thought, this is crazy. Now, on a press trip, you have a number of different stops. This was a very busy press trip. We had turned in early that night because we knew we had to get up and sample a bunch of beer at like 9 a.m. So you need to pace yourself for this sort of thing. Beer tasting is like wine tasting. You don't get drunk if you want to have anything intelligent to write about. Nobody told our colleague this. The gentleman that had to corral our colleague, who was behaving unprofessionally, was exhausted. And there was a very awkward moment as we're all standing around the next day thinking that this crisis has passed, when we realized that the individual who was making so much trouble and asking for drugs the day before had wandered into the kitchen of the tasting room and was demanding sausage.
I mean, you haven't lived unless you've had some cocaine and sausage. I mean, that's
apparently
fine
not.
living.
So now we know there are two passions in this person's life, and this is embarrassing.
Just those two.
Yes, because now I'm embarrassed as a journalist. I'm embarrassed as a former cook and server because you do not crowd people's kitchens. That's ridiculous. No good comes of this.
And I was joking. You don't put cocaine on sausage. That just ruins the taste.
I don't even want to know how you've pondered this. Anyway, so this is the nightmare that keeps continuing. This individual, after one of my other colleagues pulls him out of the kitchen. Oops, I said that. After one of my other colleagues pulls this individual out of the kitchen, they proceed to miss every single stop on our itinerary and only get to where we're going because the group WhatsApp is telling this person. This is not great. We are irritated. We are seriously confused. This individual continues consuming alcohol despite the fact that they are probably still intoxicated from the day before. And there is a moment when we are sitting down in a beautiful communal dining area, and I look at this person who is also a parent, and I see the look that every parent knows, and everybody that's ever been there the day after a really intense party, when you can tell someone's going to throw up. And I look this person in the face and I said, you will get to the bathroom right now. You will not embarrass us in front of these people. I use my absolute mom voice. You will get out of here and you will not come back until you're done. My colleague stood up. We didn't see them. But what we did see was the employees of the place we were dining scurrying with buckets and hazmat suits because they were indeed sick, and they were so sick that the entire bathroom shut down.
What a person.
I know. It was a nightmare. And it continued to get worse. It continued to keep going. That individual eventually had to leave. But then the final issue was that they didn't know where to go home or go to the hotel and rest. And it wasn't because they had forgotten where the hotel was. No, that was earlier when they were still incredibly intoxicated. The hungover version of this person realized that they could not go back to the hotel, which had been paid for by the tourism department of the country we were visiting, because the police had forcibly made them exit that place earlier. They had their luggage, they didn't know where it was, but they were banned from the premises, and the only thing that stopped the police from being called and this individual spending the night in jail was their connection to the tourism company.
That would have been schadenfreude to see this person get tossed in jail. Instead, I imagine this person got just sent back home.
No, they stayed until the end of the trip, which is a testament to the incredible graciousness of our hosts, because...
Who you can't name.
I can't name, unfortunately. Because
really great people, fine hosts, wonderful, but can't share. Can't share.
Yeah. So it's given me a whole new respect for people that arrange tours, because as much as I like to think, much like the myth of objectivity and perfect professionalism in journalism, much like the myth of objectivity, perfect professionalism in journalism is also a myth. So I think we have to call it out when we see it. This individual definitely was not being a good traveler. So I hope that in the future there'll be some better choices made, because that was embarrassing for everybody.
That was so mom of you. I hope in the future there'll be some better choices made, young person.
You know what? I used my mom voice. I've never used my mom voice with a colleague ever. But there was another gentleman in our group that was laughing because he was like, I am talking to this person like I talked to my 12-year-old. And I'm like, yep, we are using our mom and dad voices.
Do you often have to scold your little boy about using cocaine on sausages?
No, thank goodness. If I could have called this person's mother, I would have, because it was ridiculous.
Grab him by the ear and drag him into the other room and talk to your mother.
We all have our moments. We all have our demons. We all make strange choices that we regret, but to see them made so blatantly was bizarre. It was unlike anything I've ever seen, and it got to be like a comedy toward the end. Like, we just had to laugh. There's nothing else to do but laugh.
Indeed, all you can do is laugh in that kind of situation. But should we get on to language love before we head out of here?
Blah 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 blah.
So for today's language love, we're gonna hang out in my backyard in Germany with a little fernweh. And fernweh, well, Alicia has far sickness here. I mean, I guess that's a way you could read it. But basically, weh is used for pain, and fern means far. So it's the idea that you're yearning to be someplace far. So we thought that kind of fit the episode, because Instagrammers, they post these beautiful photos from around the world, and they give you a little bit of fernweh. They want you feel that urge, the desire to go far. And speaking of fernweh, where do you have fernweh for? It's hard to say that word in an English sentence. Where do you have fernweh for, Alicia?
Does it have to be a place that I've been, or is it somewhere that I want to go?
Fernweh doesn't discriminate. Fernweh is wherever you want to go. I guess fernweh discriminates in that it can't be close because, fernweh.
Ooh, that's a good one. I really want to go back to Japan. I feel like Japan, I only scratched the surface, so I'm longing for Japan.
But couldn't you say you've only scratched the surface about anywhere you've gone that you don't live in?
Yeah, but sometimes you go to a place and you're like, I understand completely that I don't know what it's like to live here, but I feel like I got a really great start. I spent a week in Japan, and I was like, this is amazing. I'm so intrigued by the contrast in this place, and I have no idea how this works. No clue.
But it works. In Japan, everything works.
Beautifully.
Oh my God, if you are a fan of a line, oh God, Japan does lines very well.
Really? You have so much order and so much reason and so much beautiful, serene tradition, and then also just neon madness.
Yes.
No in between.
Yeah, I actually wrote about this. What I call it, I feel like such a douchebag quoting myself. Oh yeah, organized chaos is how I felt Japan was. Because you had those, I would come out of any train station above ground, just because it felt so big. It felt like this was another city, not necessarily still Tokyo. But yeah, I just got to give another shout out to the lines, because like everybody who knows I live in Germany, they think like, oh yeah, order, that must be really good there, huh? But like boarding a train is madness here. Like people just don't wait. They want to get on before people get off. But in Japan, man, like they have you line up. They got little barriers. They have little queues so that you know where to stand. And it's just, it's so civilized. I hope if there is an afterlife, I hope that's how you line up to get in there, is the way the Japanese do it.
You are absolutely living in the right country, though. A place that prizes order. That's fabulous.
They prize order, but they don't live up to it in the same way that I think Japan. Japan, this is the country that apologized to everybody, like, and it went around the world for the train being like a minute, not even a minute late. It was like a few seconds late on, I think, the departure, and they apologized for it.
I had German people apologizing to me that the train was late.
They'll apologize for it, but it ain't a surprise. And I say this as somebody who loves German trains. There's definitely a split between people who will just crap on Deutsche Bahn all day, but getting sidetracked, we have a train episode, and I'm sure I could talk all about all things Deutsche Bahn all the time. So that would be your fernweh, is you have fernweh for Japan. Definitely.
And how about you?
I think my answer will always have to be Fiji, because when I was young, I saw The Truman Show. And this is way before I traveled probably beyond Ohio. If I went outside Ohio, it's probably one of the bordering states. And if you don't know the plot of The Truman Show, basically Jim Carrey is in like the very first reality TV show, but he doesn't know it. And they've done all these things to make him stay in the same town for his entire life. And he starts wanting to plan a trip to go far just because he's, how would you feel if you had to stay in the same town all your whole life and people were doing like sketchy things to keep you there? And he starts trying to plan this trip, and his goal has always been to go to Fiji because you can't go any further before you start coming back. And I just love that line, and it's probably geographically true for the most part for where I've lived most of my life. So to meet the standard of fernweh, I would have to say Fiji.
And with that bit of Jim Carrey poetry, we will leave you this week. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Travel Tomorrow. Join us every 2 weeks for stories about what's new and what's next in travel. In our next episode, Rosie Spinks from Skift talks about the hidden side of the cruise industry. And we also have episodes coming up about reversing the whitewashing of history and people literally killing themselves for the perfect selfie and how we can all avoid that fate.
I wonder if anybody's going to hear that and think that we, on this podcast, are going to reverse the whitewashing of history all by ourselves.
Why would they assume that? That gives us so much power.
They put a lot of misplaced faith in us. Yeah, you're right. Nobody will think that. In the meantime, you can find us at traveltompod on Twitter. Travel Tomorrow was taken, and Travel Tomorrow Pod was too many characters, so we are at Travel Tom Pod. If you got a better idea, let us know. Travel Tomorrow.
That's terrible.
Yeah, well. And we're Travel Tomorrow on Facebook. And you can email your thoughts, feelings, suggestions, whatever it is, to traveltomorrowpod@gmail.com.